Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about a problem that exists for some people, and that problem is that you hear a lot of people on forums, and even they've said it to me, that why is it that one side of the chain gets ground more than the other side? So an example is they're saying they're using their grinder and they believe that the left side is grinding more than the right side, or vice versa. And it's even happened to me, and it's happened to probably a lot of people. Now, you're already at a disadvantage, so to speak, when grinding chains. Because when they're brand new and the cutters are ground at the factory, and the cutters are ground before the chain's even assembled. That's the way that they do it. And you can get a digital caliper and you can measure a brand new chain. And I've found variations up to 0.4 of a millimetre. Typically on steel chain, it could vary between 0.1 to 0.3 of a millimetre. So this is not uncommon. You won't get them perfect, and that's typically what you'll find whether you've got Oregon, Archer, Carlton, Stihl, you name it, you'll get that variation. And this is done on machinery that's worth millions of dollars. So you're not going to get perfect results on a grinder either, because of those tolerances. So you've got tolerances up to 0.3 of a millimetre from the factory, and you could have 0.3 of a millimetre on your grinder, right, between the left and the right. Just the way it is, everything's got tolerance. So therefore, you can have a chain that you're going to grind, and the end result is that one side could be up to 0.5 millimetre longer than the other, and that's perfectly acceptable. I think what happens sometimes is some people watch some of the videos from Stihl and some other companies, and you see a guy that's got a caliper and he's measuring the teeth. So that's going overboard. You know, that's going really to the extreme. No one that in a Stihl shop, or for that matter, there's virtually no one that would take a caliper and measure every tooth and grind them to the exact length. That's just going overboard. Where I personally think that the mistake is made, so as I said, you're already at a disadvantage having, say, 0.3 of a millimetre from the factory. And that's from good manufacturers. On poor manufacturers, it could be 0.5 millimetre out. Okay, so let's just say you set up the left or the right on your grinder. The way that you set it up, now, another problem that can contribute to incorrect lengths is that if you're playing around with different angles all the time. So let's just say you set this one time at 60 degrees top plate cutting angle. The next time you set it at 50. The next time you got it at 25 or it's 30. Or you tilt, use 10 degrees tilt, and the next time you don't use 10 degrees tilt. By you changing all the settings on the grinder, you're going to have to grind excess metal all the time. And this can be a cause of the problem with different lengths as well. So it's a good idea that if you've got semi-chisel, and let's just say it's a Stihl chain, still recommend 50 degrees here on the top plate. Well, they recommend 40 degrees on a Stihl USG grinder, but 40 degrees is 50 degrees on an Oregon grinder. And still recommend 30 degrees on here, right? So that's Stihl's recommendation, whether it's semi-chisel or full chisel. They don't use 10 degrees downward tilt, although it's built into their RS chain from the factory. So what you should decide as a user is that if you've got full chisels and they require 10 degrees downward tilt, you either write it down somewhere that what your settings are, whether you're using 50 degrees here, 60 degrees, whether you're using 25, 30 or 10 degrees tilt. By not doing that, this can cause problems and you could end up with different tooth lengths. The other problem is that when you put a chain in and you set it up with your backstop like this and you bring the grinding wheel down, adjust your depth and all that, and I adjust the backstop so that the tooth just kisses the wheel. You can hear that scraping, right? Now that's usually not enough, but that's my starting point, right? That's the point where I turn the grinder on like this, and start to grind the tooth. Look at the tooth, and if there's not enough metal off it, just adjust the backstop until I've got it right. Once I've got it right, then I can continue doing the whole tooth. The only advice that I would give you is make sure when you put your chain in there, especially when it's half worn down, have a look at the tooth and try and get one that's roughly average length. Don't try and start your grind on a small tooth or the longest tooth. Try and get one that looks uniform. Once you've done that, you should be able to grind the whole side and not have any issues. Now, because it's set up on the left side, it's going to be when you rotate this for the other side like that, it should be that close and you shouldn't have much of a discrepancy between the left and the right. But what you need to do is that when you swap over to the other side, whether it's left or right, depends which one that you started from, is make sure that you do exactly the same thing. You adjust this so the backstop pushes the tooth forward and just rotate the wheel backwards and forwards till it just touches the teeth. Again, this is the starting position. And then slowly increase this and have a look at your tooth until you turn around and say, that's okay, that's grinding, the top plate, the side plate, everything's uniform. It's got a nice grind. The other thing is, you should only be taking a very small amount of metal off the tooth. Remember, you're sharpening the tooth. If we're sharpening a knife, we don't grind it with a grinder. We normally use an oil stone or a whetstone and we sharpen the edge. So generally speaking, you shouldn't have to take much metal off a tooth to sharpen it if the tooth is in good condition, that the tooth has just gone blunt through normal usage. It's not damaged by stones or nails or anything else. That's a different scenario altogether. So under the normal dulling effect, just through normal usage, you should be taking anywhere from 0.1 of a millimetre to about 0.2 of a millimetre, because there's movement in everything, all right? As I said, nothing's perfect. And if you sort of stick to that policy where that you adjust the backstop between the left and the right and rock the wheel backwards and forwards so that it just kisses the tooth, you should be taking the same amount of metal off the left and the right. Now, the reason that Stihl and Oregon and many other chain manufacturers will tell you to keep all the teeth uniform and the rakers uniform is that in the perfect world, if everything is equal, then the cutting performance works really well. But using the typical raker gauge, the flat constant one, it's important that the teeth are equal in length if you use this type of gauge, because it only will give a height of the raker of 0.65 of a millimetre on these four chains, 1/4 inch, 3/8, 0.325 and 3/8 pico. So if the teeth are longer and shorter, a little bit over the place, your chain could cut crooked. And that's why it's important that you would keep them as practically the same length when using this type of gauge. However, having said that, if you were to upgrade to this type of gauge from Stihl, which is a progressive depth gauge, which is going to set the depth of each individual tooth. The raker will be adjusted. The height of the raker will never be the same from one tooth to the other tooth. It'll be fairly close, but it will allow you, when you place this gauge on top of a tooth, the raker protrudes out of the window, and you're going to file that raker down based on the length of the tooth, because the back of the chain sits on here, the tooth sits on here, the raker protrudes out the window, and the little legs sit on the tie straps, and you are adjusting the raker depth based on the length of the tooth. So if you have a variation between 1 millimetre between one tooth and another tooth, this will adjust it accordingly. You could have one side, let's just say hypothetically that you had your teeth 3 millimetres shorter on the left side than the right side. If you used a flat constant depth gauge like this, it means that the short teeth and the long teeth would all have the same gap of 0.65 of a millimetre raker height depth. And that means that if you've got a couple of millimetres difference between the left side and the right side, it's going to cut crooked. A progressive depth gauge will set the correct depth of the rakers, irrespective of whether one tooth is shorter or longer, or one side of the chain is longer than the other, and it won't cut crooked. It'll cut dead straight. So there are a couple of tips out there. Just remember that I've measured steel chain and found it to be anywhere from 0.2 to 0.3 of a millimetre difference, and that's brand spanking new. And if you're hand filing chain, definitely you could get a larger discrepancy between different lengths of tooth between the left and the right. A lot of people are more stronger. If you're a right-hander, you may be stronger in the right hand, and you're going to file one side of the chain more than the other because you're stronger in one hand than the other. That's another problem. So if you set up using the backstop with very light pressure on the wheel, you do exactly this thing on the right-hand side. You don't just move the vise into position and just assume that it's going to take exactly the same amount off that it did on the other side. It'll be close, but it may not be close enough. And then the other thing is, this is the other scenario. When I measured a brand new chain, imagine that I start on my shortest tooth. If I start on my shortest tooth, that means I'm going to be grinding metal off my longest tooth. Or if I start on my longest tooth, that means I won't be grinding my shortest tooth. And that's from brand spanking new. And it doesn't matter, I've got a steel USG grinder. The same problem exists on a steel USG grinder, which costs well over $1,000, whereas this costs $150. Doesn't matter whether you've got the most expensive grinder in the world or the cheapest grinder in the world, the same problem exists because you've already got discrepancies between the length of the tooth from brand new, and it's usually going to be worse as the chain gets filed or ground during its life. So you will have different length teeth. That's pretty normal. But to turn around and say that one side of the chain is always shorter or longer, in most cases I've found out it's the operator error. And you need to revise your grinding method. And as I said, the biggest mistake people make is that when they're switching from side to side, they're not resetting this up as they did in the first place on the first side that they started to grind. I hope that information helps. It's a pretty simple tip. The only other tip that I would say, you'll notice that when you look at the wheel, this has been used quite a bit. A lot of times you can get a lot of blackening here. This is all rubbish that's off the chain. Even though that I wash my chains, you still tend to get a bit of a build-up. You've got very microscopic iron filings that all get in there. And the more and more black that you get on your wheel, it'll generate more heat. And that's why it's a good idea to regularly dress the wheel very lightly. Don't take too much material off it because the wheel won't last as long. Probably about every 10 or 15 chains, I like to give it a very, very light dress and take maybe 0.5 millimetre off it. Depends on how black it gets. I let it get probably a little bit more black than that. That's just another tip. And the only other tip while we're talking about the grinding wheel is make sure that you profile that wheel correctly. If you incorrectly profile it, it can dramatically change the top plate cutting angle, and it can change the side plate shape. When you look at the tooth from the side, the C shape can totally change if you're not correctly dressing the wheel. Look, I hope those tips helps. We've all made the same mistakes, and especially if you're a new user, you're liable to make them more than the person that's an advanced user. Please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and comments are always welcome. Bye for now.